Hey, this is Dr. Michael Hart, and today we are doing Why Learn About the Past When We Study Political Science. So, this was inspired by students inquiring why there are so many historical references in a political science class, not just in mine, but in other political science classes as well. And one of the ways to illustrate this is to discuss, in general terms, the importance of historical evidence in any political science class. So, why learn about the past? History will tell us important things, examples, and it supplies us with our observations and our data. So, by observing history and noticing patterns, we can try to form generalizations and hypotheses. So, without history, there would be no political science because there would only be news. You cannot have a science whose data is limited to the present moment. So news or current events are journalism. They're not political science. If you want science, you need to know what happened in the past so that you could put it all together, discern patterns, form hypotheses, and then test them. And if you cannot test hypotheses, at least you would have reasonable generalizations coming out of your efforts instead of just having an event after event after event. Now I want to talk about views on history, views of the past. This is important, but from a different angle of politics. This is not going to tell us why we need history as evidence. We already established that history is our evidence. What this tells us is how we as people, as institutions, as countries relate to our past. And this is important. This is not merely a theoretical discussion. This is a discussion about action. This is a discussion about the present and the future of institutions and of entire countries and peoples. Let's look at Thomas Jefferson's view of the past. I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. This expresses the need or the perspective that you can leave the history behind in order to live better. Put down the burden of history and move to better pastures. So you go beyond it in order to get a better life. Next, we see a very similar idea expressed by Henry Ford. Ford, in an interview to Chicago Tribune, stated the following: "History is more or less bunk. It's tradition. We don't want tradition. We want to live in the present. And the only history that is worth a tinker's dam is the history we made today." So Ford is even harsher on history than Thomas Jefferson. Ford wants to not just go beyond history, but perhaps reject it altogether and say history is entirely a burden. There isn't much that's useful in it, perhaps nothing at all. And what you want to do is move forward, improve production, lower the cost of production. This is how you get to a better life, not by pondering historical details. There are also psychological and social perspectives on history. To quote Gustave Flaubert, one of the great French writers of the 19th century, if not ever, "Our ignorance of history makes us libel our own times. People have always been like this." So Flaubert says we do not know about the past, which is why we complain about the present. And the psychological aspect of this is obvious. If you learn more about the past, you will have a better life today. Next, we have Lawrence Peter, a famous Canadian educator who did his later work actually in California in the United States, where he moved in the 1960s and where he taught for a while at University of Southern California. Peter is best known for his Peter's principle that in any hierarchical organization, people rise to the position of their incompetence. In other words, competent people get promoted in order to reward them with status and money for all their good work. But eventually they're promoted to a position for which their skills and background are not suitable, and so they will not be very productive in that position. Therefore, all the real work will be done by people who are actually below the position to which they are technically entitled according to the rules of promotion. But here, Lawrence Peter is talking about history. He says history repeats itself because nobody listens. This is a very often quoted, sometimes paraphrased part of Peter's work, because people many people tend to believe that as societies, as institutions, human beings tend to make the same mistakes because they fail to learn from history. And finally, we come to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was one of the few truly intellectual presidents of the United States. While pretty much all American presidents have been smart, not all have been intellectual. Not all have been able to hold, for example, different and even contradictory opinions in their minds in the same time. And Lincoln was able to do so. Lincoln did show significant ability for original thinking. So what he did was reject and affirm history at the same time. In his address in December of 1862, Lincoln said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present." So this is a rejection of history. And then he goes on to say in a somewhat ornate and highfalutin language, "The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country." So he's basically saying, don't look back none too much. It ain't gonna be helpful. Tend to look forward. But then he says, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history," and I will not quote the rest. You can read it for yourself. But he says essentially, we cannot escape history because whatever we do today will be judged in the future by future generations. So in fact, he subjects his own cohorts and his own contemporaries to the judgments of history that is yet to unfold, while simultaneously rejecting the history that came before his moment. So an interesting perspective. Where does this leave us? I think the lesson is, if you want to understand politics, you have to know at least a little bit, and hopefully more than a little bit, of history. But at the same time, if you are a politician, a policymaker who is planning the future of a country, you should also keep an open mind and understand that sometimes history should be put to the side, and technological and economic innovations perhaps should take precedence, and new approaches, new perspectives should take precedence over historical lessons and over everything that the past have actually taught us. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.